Today's tea tastes a little different." Margaret set her cup down gently, her voice steady, as she looked across the table at Jenna, who smiled without missing a beat. It was licorice tea, the same blend they had shared for years. Yet something was off, subtly, unmistakably off. Like Jenna herself, who had once clung to Margaret's arm on windy walks to school, and now sat across from her in tailored silk, hiding something behind those glossy tortoise-shell glasses. Margaret studied her daughter in the soft light of the kitchen. It was early spring, and the afternoon sun spilled over the counters, warming the tiled floor. The room was clean, meticulously so, and quiet, too quiet. This was Margaret's house, or had been. Now it felt curated, like a museum where she happened to live. She reached for her cup again, the heat settling into her palms. Jenna had always been efficient, even with affection. "How's your back lately?" her daughter asked, not unkindly, just efficient. Stiff in the mornings, Margaret replied, polite and noncommittal. Jenna nodded, then reached into her tote bag. "I thought we should go over some documents today, just so everything's clear." She placed a cream envelope on the table and slid it toward her mother with 2 fingers. "Maybe take your time, read it over, and rest afterward." Margaret looked at the envelope for a moment before picking it up. Her name was written in Jenna's handwriting, large, slanted, quick. Inside was a printed statement, a legal transfer. The house, the car, all registered under Jenna's name, already processed. At the bottom, in handwriting that didn't try to hide its contempt, was a single sentence. "Since you're too stupid to notice, all the house and car papers are under my name and you've lost everything." Margaret read it twice. The paper didn't tremble in her hands. She folded it carefully, placed it beside her teacup, and lifted the kettle to pour herself another. "You brewed this a bit light," she said, not looking up. Jenna laughed lightly, as if they were still chatting about something trivial, the weather or paint swatches for the guest room. "I'll use more leaves next time," she said. Margaret nodded, taking a slow sip. There was a coolness to her expression, now the kind of composure that frightened more than anger ever could. A veil drawn not in confusion, but in clarity. She said nothing else. The tea was still warm, and the air between them had settled into something dense, unmoving. And yet behind her calm eyes, something stirred. Something old. Something that had not stirred in years. A flicker. Not of rage, but of recognition. Margaret quietly reached into the bottom drawer of the kitchen, where she kept her favourite loose teas and a few pieces of memory she had never spoken aloud. The morning light angled through the curtains, casting soft lines across the tiled floor. The kitchen, still wrapped in its early hush, smelled faintly of licorice and lemon peel. On the counter beside the tea tin sat yesterday's envelope, its clean fold now slightly curved, like something wilted after too much sun. She didn't look at it. Instead, her fingers moved with quiet purpose, opening a small wooden box tucked behind the bags of dried hibiscus and chamomile. Inside, faded papers, hand-labelled envelopes, and a postcard from Charleston with her late husband Frank's scrawl on the back. Beneath them all, a folded note in his handwriting, "Don't forget bottom drawer." She remembered the day he said it. He had leaned on the cane more than usual, still refusing help with the groceries. That night they drank tea while the rain tapped the window. He had looked at her and said, "If anything ever happens, find Greg. He still owes me something big." Greg. That name hadn't passed through her thoughts in years. He was younger than Frank by a good decade, full of ideas and that brash lawyer's energy. They had once worked closely, but Margaret had stayed on the periphery, polite dinners, polite nods, and a general sense that Greg was useful but slippery. She set the box aside and reached for her phone. It was an old model with a cracked corner and sluggish screen, but Margaret kept it well. A folder labelled Frank's Notes waited just where it always had, untouched for years. She tapped it open. Inside, a handful of audio files and PDF scans, banking meetings, voice memos. Nothing had been renamed or sorted. Frank had never bothered. She selected one of the oldest recordings. It crackled softly before his voice filled the room, lower than she remembered, slower too, with the occasional throat clear. "Assets will remain jointly owned," he said, "but I've added a private clause, just in case Jenna isn't quite ready to handle things properly." Margaret paused the recording. The tea kettle hissed behind her. She rose, slowly refilled the kettle, and this time added more licorice than yesterday. Stronger. Bitter. It seemed right. As the kettle began to boil, she glanced at the envelope on the counter again. A sour taste rose in her throat. She sat back down and opened the contacts list on her phone. Her thumb hovered over a name she hadn't dialed in over a decade. Greg Russell. Jefferson County. Without hesitation, she tapped. "Search. Today's tea smells like an old season," came a raspy voice from the other side of the fence. "But there's something off about it, too." Margaret set her cup down gently on the patio table. The familiar voice, dry deliberate, belonged to Doris Carlson, the neighbour whose windows rarely opened, and whose presence had become something of a rumour. It had been months, maybe more, since Margaret had last spoken to her. The garden lay dormant, still branches bare, the air carrying a chill that promised spring, but hadn't yet delivered. The white fence between their yards stood tall, peeling faintly at the edges, the paint touched more by weather than by hands in recent years. But voices, especially those wrapped in memory, had no trouble crossing it. "Morning," Doris Margaret said softly. The rustle of movement came from behind a hedge of brittle azaleas. "Saw your daughter here again," Doris called. She was changing the locks. "Thought maybe you'd mention it?" Margaret didn't reply. She reached for her tea instead, letting the warmth anchor her. She didn't say anything. Doris continued, now slightly clearer as she stepped closer. "To you, I mean. About the locks." Margaret raised an eyebrow barely. "No," she said. She didn't. Doris made a sound between a sigh and a scoff. "It's her name on the deed now, isn't it? But I've lived here long enough to remember whose name was there first." The breeze stirred. Margaret looked toward the far end of the yard, where the shadows stretched longer now. Doris leaned a bit closer, though she remained behind the fence. "You helped Greg Russell, didn't you? Years ago. He was your husband's student. Bit of a rebel, but sharp. You gave him his first recommendation letter." Margaret nodded slowly. Frank always said he had a good mind, just needed someone to believe in him. "Did he ever repay that belief?" Doris asked, tone measured. "Not yet," Margaret said, her voice flat, but not cold. "Well," Doris sniffed, "he might still owe you. And if he's any decent kind of man, he'll remember." They stood in silence for a few breaths, the air between them heavy with something unspoken. Doris's voice dropped lower, more deliberate. "Some things should be witnessed, Margaret. Written down, recorded or remembered by someone who still has a spine." Margaret looked up, her gaze steady, almost amused. "I haven't forgotten a thing." "Good," Doris said, nodding slowly. "Then maybe you'll find what you need. And maybe someone else will finally listen." A gust of wind stirred the brittle leaves. Margaret stood for a moment longer, then gathered her teacup and went inside. That evening the house was quiet again. She sat at the kitchen table, the same licorice tea cooling beside her, stronger than yesterday, bitter but grounding. She opened her phone and typed Greg Russell into the search bar. The top result blinked back, Greg Russell, Jefferson County Attorney. LinkedIn, Greg, Margaret said, slowly, carefully. I'm the one who kept your Parker pen all those years ago." There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind that stretched across time rather than distance. A light rain tapped against the windows of the living room. Margaret sat alone on the floral settee opposite the mantel, where Frank's and her wedding photo leaned slightly to the left. Her fingers cradled the phone gently, as though it held something more than plastic and circuits. Mrs. Halberg, Greg's voice, finally came through, older than she remembered, but unmistakably his. "I wasn't sure you'd remember," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Are you kidding?" he replied, almost breathless. "You're the reason I made it through that last semester. That pen and Frank's recommendation opened more doors than I knew what to do with." "I'm glad," she said. Then, after a moment, "But I didn't call to talk about pens. I didn't think so." She shifted slightly, still watching the rain. "I've found myself displaced, you could say. Not legally, not yet. But emotionally. In my own home." He waited. My daughter Margaret continued, her voice even has assumed full ownership. "Of the house, the car, everything Frank and I built. I'm not accusing her. I'm only asking to be recognized, to not vanish quietly." There was a quiet exhale from Greg's side. "You're not asking me to fight her." "No. You're asking me to help you remain." "Yes." More silence. Then his voice returned, lower, resolute. "I won't promise miracles, but I can promise fairness. I won't take anything back for you, but I'll help protect what still belongs to you if the law allows it." "That's all I want," Margaret said softly. "I'll need a copy of the letter." Greg said, businesslike now, but gentle. "And if you have anything else? Audio documents, old contracts?" "I might," she said. "Send them to my office. I'll start digging from there." Margaret nodded, though he couldn't see it. "You've always kept your word, Greg. And you always noticed more than people realized." The line disconnected with a soft tone. Margaret remained seated for a while, the echo of Frank's voice stirring faintly in her thoughts. He would have approved of this, not a battle, but a stance, a quiet refusal to be erased. She stood and walked toward the hallway desk. Pulling open the drawer, her hand brushed past spare keys and old receipts before settling on a small black object. Frank's voice recorder. It still had a battery inside. She clicked the switch. The red light blinked on. Margaret pressed the stamp onto the envelope and gently let it fall into the mailbox slot. Her hand trembled slightly. Inside were copies of the pages that had kept her awake for an entire week. The midday sun filtered through the kitchen window, casting a golden hue across the table where stacks of paper lay aligned with deliberate care. The hum of the photocopier was steady and slow, like a breath being held. A copy isn't worthless, she thought. Each sheet was a fragment, a silent witness. A piece of her voice finally finding form. She sat down beside the humming machine, sorting through what she had chosen, the letter Jenna had given her, the audio recording of Frank's voice, the crumpled bills for the roof repairs from 3 winters ago. Some pages had her own notes scribbled in the margins. In faded blue ink, she had written, "This is what I remember. As for Jenna, I don't know anymore." She hesitated before sealing the envelope. The recordings were real. So was the pain. But she wasn't angry, not exactly. There was something quieter than rage, a kind of enduring ache that had learned to wear silence like armor. The phone buzzed on the counter. A message from Greg received. "Will review tonight. Some of this may take time, but it's a solid start." She poured herself a cup of licorice tea, the scent rising warm and bitter. The photocopier clicked once more, spitting out the final page. But something was wrong. The ink had smudged. She picked up the paper. Only half a sentence was legible. Mom never trust anyone. The rest bled into grey lines, unreadable. Margaret stared at it. The handwriting was Frank's. She had seen it before on notes lists' margins. This one was different, personal, unfinished. She didn't fix it. She didn't reprint. Instead, she folded the page in thirds and slid it into the small drawer beneath the teapot, a place where she kept things too fragile for the world. Then she whispered, "All right, Frank. I won't trust, but I won't seek revenge either." And the drawer closed with a soft click. "This recording is enough to restore your legal standing." Greg said, his voice steady but careful. "But are you ready for what that means?" Margaret leaned against the counter, the phone pressed gently to her ear. The kitchen was still bathed in a warm yellow light from the noon sun. Outside, the branches barely stirred. From the corner radio came the slow hum of a classical waltz, drifting like a ghost through the room. She glanced at the calendar above the stove. A small red circle marked today's date. Frank's third death anniversary. Not a coincidence. Greg's voice came back through the receiver. "Between the recording, the letter from Jenna, and the mortgage file, you have a solid claim. If you want to contest the current title, we can act. You'd be within your rights." "I don't want to sue my daughter," she replied quietly. Greg was silent for a beat. "There's another path. We start with a conversation, a private one. You lay it all out. If that fails, only then do we go to court." Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. She imagined Jenna's face at the table. Younger, softer, laughing at something Frank had said, stirring sugar into her tea. "I want to try that," she said. "A dinner, like we used to have. Just the two of us." "Good," Greg replied. "I'll email a draft, just a declaration of asset rights. You don't have to use it, but it's ready if you ever need it." The call ended. Margaret stood still. The email came moments later. She opened it on the old desktop in the den. The document was brief, precise. Her name where it had once been. The address. The house. The words, "legal restoration of shared marital property." At the bottom, a space for her signature. She didn't sign. Instead, she printed it. Took it to the kitchen, folded it neatly, and slid it into the middle drawer where the cutlery used to be. On the folder's cover, she wrote in small, careful letters, "Only open when there's nothing else to say." Then she closed the drawer slowly as the music on the radio faded into silence. "It's been a while since we had dinner together," Margaret said, sliding the lasagna dish into the oven. "You still like it mildly spicy, don't you?" Jenna looked up from her phone and nodded absently. "Sure, Mom." "That's fine." The kitchen was warm, with the glow of the old ceiling lamp, the light settling over the scratched wooden table where only two places were set. Steam curled from a pot of boiled greens, and the scent of melting cheese and oregano slowly filled the room. Margaret moved slowly, each gesture practiced the way she folded the napkins, how she placed the water glasses exactly an inch from the edge. Across the table, Jenna remained seated, phone resting next to her fork, its screen lighting up every few moments. Margaret smiled politely. "I thought we could celebrate your new job. Small things matter." Jenna gave a short smile, more of an obligation than joy. "It's just a promotion. Nothing major." They ate in silence for the first few minutes. Margaret scooped a piece of lasagna onto Jenna's plate, then her own. When Jenna picked up her utensils before Margaret even sat down, something inside her faltered. When she was little, she always waited for me to take the first bite. "I remember," Margaret said gently, "you used to sit at that same spot, swinging your legs, waiting for your father to ask about your drawings." Jenna didn't look up. "That was a long time ago." "I suppose it was," Margaret replied, still keeping her voice soft. But I haven't forgotten. Jenna's fork paused. Mom, you still don't get how the world works now. It's not about memories or sentiment. Things move fast. People protect themselves. I understand more than you think, Margaret said, placing her hand lightly on Jenna's. I may not grasp everything, but I haven't forgotten who I am. Jenna flinched slightly. Her fingers tensed, then pulled away as if the contact had burned her. She didn't say anything. The meal dragged on. Small talk, work, weather. Margaret tried to meet Jenna's eyes, but they darted elsewhere to her phone, her plate the window behind her. Eventually, Jenna stood. Thanks for dinner. I have to go. Early meeting. Margaret nodded. Drive safe. The door closed softly behind her. Margaret returned to the table. The lasagna on Jenna's plate sat untouched. Its edges cooled the top cheese, stiffening under the yellow light. She didn't move to clean. Instead, she sat down, slowly folded her hands, and stared at the food between them. The sound of the paper shredder buzzed irregularly, a harsh, stuttering rhythm that didn't belong in the stillness of morning. Margaret paused outside the study door. A faint, burnt paper scent lingered in the air, sharp and dry. She didn't knock. She didn't ask. Earlier that morning, Jenna had left quickly, a rushed goodbye, her keys jangling in one hand, her coffee thermos in the other. The study had been locked before she went. Unusual. That room used to be Frank's reading space. It had never needed a key. Now the door stood slightly ajar. Margaret stepped in carefully. The light filtered through the slats of the blinds, drawing thin lines across the wooden floor. The shredder sat near the desk, still warm. In its tray, confetti-like strips of paper curled and layered atop one another. She bent down and lifted a handful. Most were fragments, dates, lines of text, too thin to make sense of. But a few carried larger blocks of type. One edge showed the header of a mortgage document. Another fragment revealed half a signature. Then, buried among them, one corner bore a familiar name, Ank C. Russell Frank's name. Margaret didn't speak. She didn't gasp. She took out her phone, steadied her hand, and snapped several photos slowly, carefully, from different angles. Then she returned the strips to the tray undisturbed, as if nothing had happened. She stepped out, closing the door gently behind her. Later that morning, she walked across to Mrs. Carlson's front porch and politely asked to borrow a pair of garden shears. Doris handed them over without question, though her sharp eyes lingered an extra beat. Back inside, Margaret texted Greg, I think it's time we prepare for the next step. That night, after the dishes were done and the house settled into its usual hush, she opened the drawer under the old tea set. The envelope Greg had sent the legal declaration was still inside. Margaret pulled it out, dusted the cover gently with her sleeve, and set it beside her cup. She didn't open it. Not yet. In the late afternoon light, Margaret moved slowly through the living room, feather duster in hand, as she always did at that hour. Dust had settled along the edge of the bookshelves and crept into the corners of the window panes. She hummed faintly, an old habit she couldn't quite remember when she'd picked up. When she reached the mantel, she stopped. The wedding photo, the one of her and Frank standing beneath the elm tree, his hand gently resting over hers, was gone. In its place was a sleek frame, metallic silver, holding Jenna's graduation portrait. Her daughter smiled from within the glass, polished and poised in a dark academic robe. The image felt unfamiliar, foreign, even though it was her own daughter. Margaret's hand hovered near the frame but didn't touch it. That photograph. No one was ever allowed to move it, not even during spring cleaning. Frank had once said, if the house burns down, save that picture. She'd laughed then, not knowing how true those words might one day feel. She stepped back, phone in hand, and dialed. Jenna answered on the third ring. Hi, Mum. Everything okay? When did you change the photo on the mantel? There was a pause. Oh, that I switched it yesterday. The old one was a little outdated. Don't you think it's time we all moved on? Moved on? Margaret didn't reply. The call ended with polite nothings, and then silence filled the room again. She walked slowly to the storage closet, pulling out a small box wrapped in cloth. Inside lay the original wedding photo, still in its wooden frame, its edges worn with time. She carried it to her bedroom, placing it carefully on a small table beside the lamp. There in the golden hour, glow the frame looked almost alive again. From her drawer, Margaret took out the envelope Greg had prepared. She unfolded the legal document, read it one last time, and signed her name. Her handwriting was steady. She slid the paper beneath the photo frame where Frank's eyes seemed to meet hers, calm, watchful, and proud. Moments later, a soft chime announced a message. Greg, send me the signed version. I'll begin the next steps. And Jenna, would you like to speak to her yourself? Or should I? Margaret looked at the screen for a long moment. Then, without replying, she turned the lamp off and sat quietly beside the frame. I used to think you'd lost your sharpness, Mrs. Carlson said softly, her fingers wrapped around a chipped teacup. Until I heard that recording. The lavender bush between their houses rustled faintly in the breeze. Margaret stood at the fence, a pie tin in hand, the scent of warm apple mingling with the sharpness of the herb. The old wooden chair Doris sat in creaked, but didn't protest much like its owner. Margaret said nothing for a moment. Then she placed the pie down on a small stool nearby, dusting crumbs from her sleeve. I didn't think I'd be needing allies at this age, she said almost to herself. Mrs. Carlson looked at her eyes shaded by decades. But you do, and you're not alone. Earlier that morning, Margaret had called Greg. She'd asked him to send a short clip, 1 minute only, from the recordings Frank had left. The section she chose was specific Frank's voice, steady, but clipped, saying, "We need to keep that clause intact, Maggie. She's not ready to own this. She's rewriting us before we're gone." Now that clip played again, tinny, from the small Bluetooth speaker Margaret placed on the garden ledge. Doris listened. She didn't interrupt. When the recording stopped, there was a long pause. Then I remember that day. He came to the fence right here. His hand was shaking. He told me, "She's rewriting our story already, Mag doesn't see it yet." Margaret closed her eyes briefly, as if bracing against the wind that wasn't there. He knew, she whispered. Doris reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out an envelope yellowed at the corners, the flap sealed with an old sticker of a feather. "He asked me to keep this. Told me not to open it unless you ever came asking." Margaret took the letter with both hands almost reverently. Inside, written in Frank's blocky, looping hand, was a single paragraph. "If I'm gone and things begin to unravel, find someone who remembers the truth. Don't let memory be manipulated. Don't let silence win." Margaret sat down on the edge of the garden bed. The lavender touched her sleeve, its scent grounding her in a way few things could now. Doris looked at her and nodded slowly. "If you need me to testify legally or otherwise, I will. I saw more than I admitted, and I can't stay silent anymore." From her pocket, Margaret's phone buzzed once. Greg heard from her. "Or shall we proceed from our side?" She didn't reply yet. She folded the letter, placed it gently back in the envelope, and held it to her chest. Some truths didn't fade. They just waited to be remembered. "Are you certain?" Greg's voice came softly through the screen. "Once we open this for certification, some things won't go back to how they were." The glow of the desk lamp cast a long shadow along the wooden floor. Margaret sat at the edge of her bed, still in her pale cardigan, the hem brushing her knees. The iron box lay at her feet untouched for 3 years. She had not opened it since Frank died. Greg watched her through the Zoom window, his expression unreadable but patient. He had just emailed the final set of documents for legal submission. "You don't have to decide tonight," he said gently. But Margaret only nodded once and bent down. The lock clicked softly. She opened the box. Inside were papers arranged neatly, their edges worn but cared for. Frank's handwriting on yellowing envelopes, a manila folder labelled Joint Assets, and at the very bottom a folded letter with Jenna's name in blue ink, the letters delicate, almost trembling. She removed the contents one by one. The will, written in Frank's slanted script, witnessed and dated. The property transfer contract stating clearly the stipulation of dual consent for any future reassignment. A photograph of Frank and Jenna planting the sapling in the front yard 10 years ago. And the letter. Margaret unfolded it slowly. Her eyes didn't water. She didn't sob. Only her breath, softer now, kept rhythm with the quiet turning of each page. The words were personal, aching with love and disappointment. Frank had written, "If you're reading this, I hope it's because you're ready to listen. Not to me, but to what's fair. To your mother." Margaret's fingers paused. She took out every document except that one, that she folded back with care and placed in a separate envelope. She did not include it in the pile meant for Greg. Some things she thought were meant to be offered, not used. Greg's voice returned, distant but steady. "Once we notarize, it's on record. There's no gentle way to take that back." Margaret placed the documents into a clean folder, then closed the iron box and slid it back under the bed. She returned to her desk, the screen now showing a blinking cursor on Greg's email. She was about to respond when her phone buzzed. "Jenna, Mom. We need to talk. Urgently. Please don't do anything you don't understand." Margaret looked at the message for a long time. Then she turned off the desk lamp. Some truths waited years in silence. But once opened, they didn't whisper. They rang clear. Jenna stood in the hallway, a paper clenched in her hand. "Where did you get this?" "Mom." Her voice was tight, as if already mid-accusation. Margaret turned her head from the window. Afternoon light cast long bars across the living room. It fell across Jenna's face, illuminating one half, while the other remained in shadow, a perfect line drawn by the fading sun. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked to the kitchen counter and poured 2 cups of tea. "Sit," Margaret said quietly. "It's licorice, stronger than usual." Jenna stayed by the window. "I saw him. Greg Russell. Leaving your house yesterday." Margaret placed 1 cup at the table, sat down, and waited. "I have my own lawyer," Jenna continued. She set the document down with a loud tap. "We both know this paper doesn't mean what it used to. Law's about what you can prove now, not what you remember from some dusty drawer." Margaret looked at the paper. A photocopy of the original property deed, or what looked like one. But something about the ink, the spacing, felt off. "You want to renegotiate?" she asked, gently lifting her cup. "I want balance," Jenna replied. Her voice was sharp, but her eyes darted once quickly to the floor. "You're clinging to something that was never yours alone. Dad may have loved you, but he didn't make you the sole keeper of this family." The tea steamed quietly between them. Margaret took a sip. "And if I ask you, why do you need it, Jenna? This house, this name, this control?" Jenna didn't expect the question. Her lips parted as if ready to fire something back then faltered. Because she said after a long pause, "What do you have if Dad's not here, Silence? Then you had his love, his memories, his years. I just got echoes." Her voice caught just for a moment, and then it hardened. I deserve more than echoes. Margaret set her cup down slowly. You're not wrong, she said. But you're not right either. Jenna's jaw tightened. She grabbed her purse. This isn't over. She strode to the door, leaving the paper behind. Margaret waited until the door clicked shut. Only then did she reach for the document. The texture was slightly different, the typeface too clean. A signature had been moved, nudged into a new alignment. She turned the page over. In faint pencil, a note remained from the copier tray, Revenue 2, alternate clause format. Margaret folded the paper, placed it in the drawer beneath the radio, and looked out at the driveway where Jenna's car had just pulled away. There were some truths even shadows could not hide. This isn't a trial, the attorney said evenly. It's a mediation. But what's decided here can carry legal weight. The conference room was quiet, lined with soft tan walls and oak wood trim. The chairs were leather-worn, but dignified. A car passed outside its hum, barely audible through double-paned glass. Margaret sat still, hands folded in her lap, her shawl neatly draped. Across the table sat Greg, focused but calm. The documents lay in front of him in a single manila folder. The door creaked open. Jenna stepped in 15 minutes late, phone in hand. She didn't look at her mother as she sat beside her lawyer, a younger woman in a sharp blazer, Anna Collins. No greetings. Just silence. Greg began. Ms. Collins, we are not here to accuse, we're here to clarify. My client, Mrs. Margaret Fielding, retains legal co-ownership of the estate in question. We have documentation to support that, including a will, several recorded statements, and a notarized letter of intent from her late husband, Frank Fielding. Anna shifted in her seat. My client was under the impression that the property was hers alone, based on signed transfers. That were altered, post-signature? Greg interrupted, still politely. There are inconsistencies in the file metadata and handwriting mismatches verified by a third party. Jenna finally looked up, eyes sharp. Is this about punishing me? Margaret remained still. Greg spoke again. Mrs. Fielding has no intention of suing. Her sole request is to have her position restored as co-owner as originally intended. Anna opened her mouth, but closed it again. Then, for the first time since the meeting began, Margaret spoke. I'm not here to reclaim what you think you've taken from me. I only want the truth placed back where it belongs. Her voice was soft, but carried. She opened her purse and placed 2 envelopes on the table. Greg slid one forward. This is a handwritten will, written by Mr. Frank Fielding 3 months before his passing. Unaltered. Unwitnessed, but with a corroborating recording which we've submitted privately. The second envelope was untouched. Greg looked at Jenna. This is a letter your father wrote. He gave it to someone he trusted. She kept it safe until recently. Jenna didn't move. Anna glanced at her, then at the letter. Greg didn't push it. Silence returned, heavy and strange, like the pause before a storm changes direction. Finally, Jenna leaned toward Anna and whispered, barely audible, If I sign it back, do you think she'll forgive me? Anna's eyes did not shift from the letter. She said nothing. The room stayed still. Only the ticking of a discreet wall clock marked the weight of time. She won't sue, Greg said, as the car pulled away from the law office. But she knows she's already lost. Margaret looked out the window. The afternoon sun had begun to dip behind the distant fields. Golden streaks stretched across the windshield, softening the edges of barns' fences and spring trees, still unsure about blooming. Greg glanced at her but said no more. They passed a small field of rosemary once wild and fragrant. Frank used to stop the car there just to pick a sprig for the kitchen. Back at the house, Greg placed the worn box of documents gently on the kitchen counter. I've delivered the originals to the property office, he said. This is your copy. Margaret nodded. Would you help me with something? She asked, voice low but clear. Frank's rosemary pot, it's gone dry. I'd like it alive again. They stepped into the backyard. The soil was stubborn, but together they worked quietly. Greg loosened the roots. Margaret pressed them gently down her hands, firm, unshaken. When he left, she lingered a moment beside the plant, brushing dirt from her skirt. Then she returned inside. The house smelled of quiet and aroma between tea and time. Margaret took the framed wedding photo from her bedroom and hung it once more in the hallway, exactly where it had been, before Jenna replaced it. The light caught Frank's eyes in the image, steadfast, watching. She placed the teapot on the stove. The familiar scent of licorice root and lemon balm filled the room. Then she sat at the table and opened her old journal. The pen hesitated, then moved slowly across the page. No one can take away what was once kept through love. The ink dried slowly. She paused. In her mind, a memory bloomed. Frank kneeling beside their daughter when she was small, whispering, "If one day you do something wrong, your mother will still love you. But you'll have to face what you did." The sound of paper, the lightest shuffle, and the kettle's soft whistle were all that followed. Until a knock came. Margaret stood. She walked to the door and opened it gently. Jenna was there. Her hands were empty. Her eyes hadn't yet found the courage to meet her mother's. Jenna sat down across the table, her hands trembling. "Mom, I don't know where to start." Morning light filtered in through the curtains, warming the soft porcelain of the kitchen. The table was set simply 2 cups, a ceramic plate with broken shortbread, and the familiar steam of licorice tea. Margaret poured slowly, the amber liquid rising with quiet grace. She didn't rush, didn't answer. "I didn't hate you," Jenna said, fingers wrapped around her cup, but not drinking. "I just wanted to matter. I wanted someone to remember me, not just Dad." Margaret nodded, letting the silence sit between them a moment longer before speaking. "Your father feared forgetting more than dying. He once told me, 'If my mind goes before my heart, I want the words I leave behind to remember for me.' That's why he wrote so much down, not to hold power, to hold love." Jenna looked down. Margaret reached into a drawer beside her and took out the old recorder. She pressed play. Frank's voice, calm and steady, echoed gently across the kitchen. "If one day you're reading this, it means I'm gone. But please remember what's written. Here isn't just law, it's memory. Memory of love, of trust, of the life we built." Jenna closed her eyes. Her breath shook. And then tears. Not the kind that begged for forgiveness or made excuses, just the quiet, crumbling kind that admitted for the first time the truth. "I changed the contract," she whispered. "I was afraid. Afraid you'd choose memories of him over me." Margaret placed her hand over her daughter's, not tight, not cold. "Thank you," she said softly, "for telling the truth." They sat that way for a while. The tea cooled. Then Jenna reached into her coat pocket. She placed a folded document on the table. The title in bold at the top read, "Voluntary Relinquishment of Property Claim." "I want to start again," Jenna said, "without pretending, just us." "I was once pushed out of my own home," Margaret wrote, "not anymore." The rosemary bush had taken root again. It bent slightly in the breeze, sturdy, despite the cool air of late autumn. A week had passed since the meeting. The sun was softer now, laying golden sheets of light across the garden, where dry leaves whispered their quiet goodbye. Inside, Margaret folded Frank's shirts, with care, smoothing the fabric over each button. The room still smelled faintly of old books and cedar. She placed the shirts back into the drawer, not because anyone would wear them again, but because love, too, could be kept in order. A letter came that morning. She opened it at the kitchen table with hands that no longer shook. Dear Margaret, all documents are finalized. The property is legally restored to your name. You asked for no fanfare, and so there will be none. Just a note to say you were right to believe in truth. Greg. Margaret smiled. She didn't need the law to tell her what she already knew. Later that day, Jenna stopped by. No words, just a quiet knock and a familiar face holding something in hand. A photo. The one of them, Margaret and little Jenna at the county fair cheeks, pressed together, laughter frozen in time. The corner had once torn away in a moving box, but now it had been carefully mended with clear tape. Jenna placed it on the counter and left. Margaret sat again in her chair by the window, tea warm in her hands. She picked up her journal and wrote, "I didn't win. I simply didn't fall." Outside, Mrs. Carlson stood by the fence trimming lavender. She looked up and offered a small wave. Margaret returned it. Not everything needed to be spoken. Some truths, when protected long enough, became homes of their own. She was once a silent guest in her own home, dismissed by signatures and silence. But in the end, it was not confrontation that restored her place. It was memory, dignity, and quiet evidence. Justice may arrive late, but when it does, it speaks louder than accusation. Sometimes it only takes a single cup of tea and a steady hand to rewrite what others tried to erase. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and comment your thoughts below. Type 1 if you resonate with this story.